and you're just like, yeah, I need to take a break from this. I can't do this person. Like, I'll give you an example, okay? The woman that drowned her kids in Texas, I was watching a documentary about her, and I had to turn it off because I have a toddler myself, and when they started talking about her drowning a baby, I just can't do it, you know what I mean? But has there been anything for you, because I know you've obviously done more work in the field than me, where you're just like, that touches too close to home, or whatever the case may be?
You know what, that's a good question, and there really hasn't been, but I think part of that reason is that my involvement really is gathering numbers and analyzing data and looking at trends, and so I kind of look at it maybe from a very dispassionate perspective.
Right.
So, for example, if I'm going through and even looking at let's say a true crime book, I'm going through there just looking for certain types of information as opposed to actually reading every sentence or every paragraph about a crime. So I think for what I do, I miss that. But I think people who study it, maybe not so much from a data perspective, I can certainly see that probably is something that happens with them.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're not sitting there looking at the pictures and having to deal with that part, I can understand how you can kind of take the humanity out of it. I guess that's what I'm looking for there.
And that's what you do, and it's in some ways it's kind of sad to say that, but when you're just looking at numbers, it does change your perspective, certainly.
Okay, so this, I guess, would be a good point for me to kind of let you steer the boat here. If there are some things that maybe you want to talk about that you think people would find interesting without me even bringing it up, go ahead and throw it out there, because I know there's a hell of a lot more that I haven't brought up that you could on your own.
Sure. Maybe what I can do is kind of give you some highlights of some of the things that we found with our analyses over the last few years that have kind of some of the myths, I think, about serial killers, but also have identified some interesting trends. You know, I think one of the things that we found is that if you go back and look at kind of what was the traditional profile of a serial killer, you know, which is the white male in the mid to late 20s, one of the things that we found in our data is that although serial killers in general certainly are male, that depending on when the time period that you look at, if you look at all the serial killers in the U.S. combined, slightly more likely to be white. But one of the things I'll talk about in just a minute is if you look in the last 3 decades, African Americans are the most common for serial killers. And then if you look at the average age, which is in the late 20s, it almost would seem that profile would fit. But when you look at how many serial killers were white males mid to late 20s, the number drops below 15%. So one of the things I think that we found that's interesting is that kind of that traditional profile is not accurate. And part of that is because you're putting all those different types of serial killers together when there's quite a few different types. So, for example, if you look at something such as a black widow as a serial killer, somebody who's killing their husbands or their spouse for money, primarily that's going to be white and can be female. Where if you're looking at a serial killer, for example, who's killing prostitutes, is going to be male. So that initial profile turned out not to be particularly accurate. One of the other things that we found interesting is involved race. And again, if you go ahead and take a look at all the serial killers that we studied combined, what you'll find is that whites are by a little bit over 50% in terms of serial killers. It's about 52%. But if you go back and look, for example, at starting in the decade of 1990s, African Americans, 48% of the serial killers were African American compared to 41% of whites. And then if you go to 2000 and 2010, it's right around 57% African American and 31% white. And so that's been a finding that has surprised a lot of people. The other thing that I think that is maybe interesting about serial killers, at least in terms of trends, is that the number of serial killers actually peaked in the 1980s and has been steadily declining since then. So, which is a good thing, certainly.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's funny because a lot of the major serial killers that you hear about were late 70s, early 80s type people, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Gacy, those types of guys. And it's something that I wanted to clarify for everybody, because you see a lot of definitions out there, you see a lot of criteria out there. For you all, when you're gathering these stats on serial killers, and I use that in quotes, what is it exactly that you all qualify as a serial killer? Because a lot of people say, well, that's a mass murderer, that's not a serial killer, that's this. What is it to you all that makes a serial killer?
Well, and that's a great question, because in the field right now there's a lot of debate about what the definition should be. Right now, most folks that study serial killers use the FBI definition, the current FBI definition, which is 2 or more homicides on 2 or more occasions. So, for example, if you killed 5 people at one time in one location, that's going to be a mass murderer, and that's not going to be a serial killer. If you killed several people within one event, so for example, maybe somebody killed their parents, drove across town, killed their girlfriend, drove to another part of town, killed some of their friends, even though you have killed 2 or more people, it's really one event. And where there's a lot of disagreement in the field right now is, how do you define an event? So, for example, if the killings all occurred within a 3-hour period, I think most people would agree that's one event. But you could have somebody who kills across a 2 or 3 day period with really no break, or what used to be called a cooling off period, and that used to be called a spree killer, but the FBI right now is no longer separating the spree from the serial killers. So other researchers basically look at things like motive. If the motive is financial, they're not going to count them as a serial killer. Or if the victim is somebody that is family, they're not going to count them as a serial killer. So one of the things that we did early on, really in the Radford database, is we decided we weren't going to try to set the definition for the rest of the world. So instead, what we've done is we've used that really global FBI interpretation or definition of the two or more separate events, and included everybody that fits that. And so if there's a researcher that's using our database that disagrees, so for example, there's one expert in the field who basically believes it has to be at least 5, then that person can go in and set the criteria at 5, their research just based on those 5. Gang members would be another great example, that if you look at the definition of a serial killer, there are many gang members or members of organized crime who certainly fit the definition of a serial killer, but they're very different. And so one of the things that we've done right now in our database is we actually try to use the term right now multiple event killer, and then within that we start to divide things into individual killers, team killers, and a term that we're using now, which is called an organizational killer. Now, this is not the same thing as an organized killer that people are probably familiar with from the FBI research, but an organizational killer would be somebody who's killing as part of an organization, and that would be, a gang, a criminal enterprise. And so we have those in our database, but they're set up so that if a researcher doesn't believe, for example, that should be in there, they can remove them and do their analysis without them in there.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought all that up, because there's just so many definitions out there. It's so confusing to people now, and it's like anytime you bring up somebody, the immediate reaction is, well, that's not a serial killer. And I'm like, I don't, you know what I mean? I don't really, it's hard to say what is and what isn't. When you do statistics on the guys that you consider serial killers, I'm not sure if you've ever done it on the ones that they consider mass murderers or spree killers previously. Are there characteristics, aside from, of course, the murders themselves, that match up, or is it one of those things where they're totally different animals?
I'm not an expert on mass murderers, but my understanding from what I've seen is that the profile and the motivations are very different. And so in our database, we don't have any of the mass murderers in there. We do have some of the spree killers in there, again, because the FBI no longer separates that out as a definition. And one of the projects that we're going to have some of our students work on coming up this year really is actually comparing the folks who are spree versus those that are serial, and see if they are different folks. And if they're different, then they need to be separate. If they seem to be pretty similar in terms of background and potentially motivation, then it makes sense to combine them.
Yeah, we got off on an awesome tangent, by the way. So I'll let you continue with anything else you wanted to throw out there, because again, it's just also fascinating to me what you do. Hopefully everybody else agrees with me, because I just think the stats of these guys, even if you, or girls too, if you just put them together, I think it's stunning how similar yet how different all these different people who are doing similar things are. But continue on. Sorry, I didn't mean to get off on a tangent there.
Oh no, I think that was a great topic, and it's one that there's a lot of disagreement and certainly a lot of discussion about. I guess if I was thinking about maybe any other topics that were interesting from the serial killers, one would be IQ, and we have IQ of 256 serial killers. And again, I think this is one of those when if you look at the media portrayal of a serial killer, they come, kind of the Hannibal Lecter, they come across as being these really super intelligent folks. But what we find really is that if you lump them all together, the average IQ is really about 95, and so they're in the average range, a little bit to the low average, but they're in the average range. Even though there are certainly examples of serial killers that have very high IQs, there are many examples of serial killers that have very low IQs. And so one of the things that we found that was interesting involving IQ is that if you take a look at the serial killers that have killed, for example, 2 folks versus 3 versus 4 versus 5 or more, the average IQ of the folks that have killed, for example, 2 or more is right around 89, where if you look at the people who have killed 5 or more, it's right there around 99. So you get a 10-point difference, which is IQ-wise is actually quite a bit. The way that they kill, IQ is related to that even, that the folks that obviously that use bombs have the higher IQ, but that makes sense. But the serial killers that typically will strangle have higher IQs than those who bludgeon. So we think that there may be some really interesting things involving IQ with serial killers, but they're certainly not all really bright folks. In fact, on average, that they're very average into the low average. And then maybe go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it actually kind of intrigues me that there's so many people with lower IQs that can even get to the status of serial killer, you know what I mean? Because basically that would mean they had to get away with it at least for a little while, which surprises me that they're able to, but I guess that's circumstantial.
Well, I think it is, and I think if you look at a lot of the serial killers, you're really not seeing some criminal mastermind. It's just a matter of they're choosing a victim, for example, that maybe somebody such as a prostitute or somebody who is a runaway. That takes a long time for police to even notice that, number one, somebody's dead, and then that they have multiple victims and that those victims are linked. And so with the fact that it takes the amount of time to do that, I think it's maybe not too surprising that folks that with a low IQ can kill multiple people and not get caught for a while.
When you brought that up, I had just different names just scrolling through my head, like, yeah, he's right there, he's right there, he's right there. So you make a good point, but continue on. I apologize.
Oh no, I appreciate the questions. I guess the last thing really that in terms of maybe data that we've looked at would be comparing the United States versus other countries. And I think this is an area where the information that's out there, including the information we've put out there, can be really misleading. So if you look at the serial killers who've been caught, there have certainly been many more serial killers in the United States than the rest of the world combined. even though if you look at